Welcome, everyone. My name is Suzanne Clary. I'm the president of the Board of Trustees for the J Heritage Center, and we're so excited to have you here for our second O'Neill Fellowship presentation with two spectacular scholars. Let me tell you a little bit about the fellowship, its history, and how it was established. It was established in 2022, 2 years ago, in memory of Margaret, Maggie, Nolan O'Neill, class of 2021 at Columbia University. She studied political science, government, and political philosophy with a keen interest in the application of those studies in the modern world. What a far-sighted student. Her family and friends created this academic opportunity to advance scholarship in American history and geopolitics, very, very important now, while also fostering respectful dialogue of topics relevant to the evolution of our nation, the shaping of its democracy, and our place in the global arena. Again, how timely is this talk? Inspired by Maggie's own passion for intellectual discourse and boundless curiosity about our country's history and political landscape, this fellowship allows one or more. Last year we had one. This year, thanks to the generosity of the O'Neills and many of you in this audience, we have two fellowships for undergraduate or graduate students at Columbia University to use this property as a campus. We are an educational campus. To use our limited archives, I would say we're very good at directing you towards the right archives and the right people, although our archives are growing thanks to many of you here too. To use our advisors that we put you in touch with. Both Wena and Zachary, I'm going to tell you more about them later, were able to speak with different professors at Columbia about their projects. The fellowship does afford a stipend, which again, how can you study without funding? It's so important to scholarship, for an immersive summer experience. The selected fellows are then invited to present their final research to the public in a fall program. It has been an incredible pleasure for our board, many of whom are here, advisory board and staff, to work with these students, and we are beyond grateful to the O'Neill family and supporters of this meaningful fellowship. I also want to thank Michael Gately, raise your hand, Michael Gately, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for American Studies at Columbia, who without his role in administering this fellowship, and you receive many, many very qualified candidates for these fellowships. We really couldn't do it without Michael, and Michael, I want to thank you. I also want to thank our fellows advisors. They each had advisors on this project, on their projects with professors at Columbia University. And this is a partnership we hope to grow. Last year, one fellow, this year, two fellows. Who knows what the future holds as we restore this building and this entire campus for more use. Our inaugural O'Neill Fellow, Fenway Donegan, is here today, and I would like to invite him to share a few words with us about what this experience meant to him. Can we give him a round of applause?
Hello, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new faces here. I'm just going to talk for a minute about what this fellowship has meant to me in my time at Columbia and my time as a American history researcher. I was the inaugural J Heritage O'Neill Fellowship fellow. I am now a senior at Columbia College studying American Studies. I am currently working on my thesis, which deals specifically with Native American law and treaty rights, land ownership, all subjects that I started working on with this fellowship during my time at the J Heritage Center. I feel very honored and grateful to have been able to spend 3 months here learning how to do archival research, learning how to consult with historians that specialize in these specific areas that I'm interested in, learning how to send emails explaining my project and talk to people and, get funding and all of this sorts of stuff that's important for research that all of the American Studies students I'm working right now with in my thesis seminar are having to learn for the first time. I feel like I've been able to bring all my experience to the table. I feel very grateful about that. On top of that, I can't speak highly enough about the kind of institutional support that the J Heritage Center provides for scholars. Coming in here, I didn't know how to make a project that was more than a semester long without explicit rubrics and guidance and the kind of stuff that you receive in the classroom. The freedom is very exciting, but can also be terrifying. And so I feel very grateful that I had the people that I did at the J Heritage Center support me, specifically Suzanne. You were just wonderful. I really appreciated your encyclopedic knowledge of everything John Jay and everything that this center held. You directed me to not only the Westchester archives, but specific areas in the city that might have been of interest. You were constantly able to give feedback on my project in addition to my advisors at Columbia, and just all around I learned how to bring everyone in conversation together to create the best possible project. As for what the project has meant to me after my time doing it, not only has it influenced my thesis work, but it has influenced my job work. I was able to connect with Representative Stephen Otis, who attended my fellowship presentation. I spoke with him several times after he was interested in the work that I had been doing, and about a month later, I got an email from him asking if I wanted to come work with him on his team. Ever since then, I have been working with him as a staffer. I work on data and internet policy, specifically working to safeguard the data privacy rights of New Yorkers and address some of the challenges with artificial intelligence advances. It's been totally different than the work that I've been doing here in terms of subject, but incredibly similar in terms of method. The same research practices, the same ability to get in contact with people, to sort through, to find experts that I developed here has translated directly into that work. I was in Albany this summer, and I was able to really put all of the stuff I learned here into practice, helping not only residents of Rye and the J Heritage Center, but hopefully all New Yorkers achieve a better standard and quality of life on the internet. So I mean, that's a lot from one fellowship, from 3 months. I can't thank everyone here enough, and specifically the O'Neills. I really can't express how much this has meant to me, and I am so grateful to have had this opportunity, and I very much wish that I could have met her. And thank you all so much.
All right, so we have 2 scholars to hear from today. We're going to hear from Wena first. We're going to take a brief break in between the presentations, and then we'll hear from Zachary. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read both of their bios together now. So you just have a breadth of the things that were percolating here. Because one of the other things that was really nice about having Wena and Zachary here this summer, we had other fellows in other disciplines, in environmental law. And all of these students got to meet each other and exchange ideas. And I think you're going to hear some references between Wena and Zachary's presentations. So that's why I'd like to read both the bios first. Starting with Wena. Wena Teng is a proud first-generation student studying race and ethnicity and history at Columbia with a specialization in political economy. Born in Queens to immigrants and then living several years in Asia, Wena is interested in tracing immigration movements and connecting them to a larger geopolitical, you're going to hear that word a lot, geopolitical, because Maggie was really interested in geopolitics, geopolitical themes of economy, labor, and politics. In beginning her research, and again, these fellowships are a journey, because you start thinking that you're going to do one thing, and then as you learn and you talk to other students and professors, you might find yourself on a different path. Wena first examined John Jay's interest in propelling commerce with China to bolster both independence and economic prosperity, comparing it with his other political stances, including abolition efforts. And you're going to hear about that from Zachary. But as she refined her work with her advisor, she focused on the racialized origins of the U.S.-China trade policy during the early Republic, and moved on to the Civil War and the post-1965 Hart-Celler Act. She analyzed the inevitable events and ripple effects of immigration that undergirded trade, and the impacts, again, inevitable, on migrant workers in ethnic labor communities in post-Civil War to the 21st century. Wow. Okay. Her talk will highlight the self-sufficiency of immigrants and the history of policies affecting the lives of immigrant workers. At Columbia, because she does so much else, because this is like a small little bit of what you've been doing. She serves as university senator and a Laidlaw scholar. She has also worked with the Urban Justice Center's Street Vendor Project on policies to accommodate licenses and legal resources for vendors. Her experiences include an internship at the White House and positions as Columbia Law Review DEI Director. A 2024 New York Truman Scholar, Wena intends to pursue a JD PhD to reconcile gaps in labor law and policies that have historically excluded protections for migrant workers. In her free time, she enjoys writing prose, practicing the Chinese harp, and building intergenerational friendships with street vendors on food crawls around New York City. And she's also a fantastic photographer. If you check our Instagram feed, she took some beautiful pictures of the garden this summer. So, Zachary Vanderslice is a senior at Columbia University, majoring in history and applied math. As an O'Neill Fellow, his research focused on early free Black community formation in New York during the gradual emancipation era, which was 1799 to 1827, following John Jay's signing of the Gradual Emancipation Act into law. In 1799, New York State began to end slavery. And you're going to hear a lot about this because in 2027, we're going to celebrate 200 years of emancipation, where the state of New York was the first state to legalize, to make slavery illegal. Other states had tried but failed. New York was the first in 1827. So Zachary's research follows the signing of that Emancipation Act, but what it really meant in real life. It freed children of enslaved people, but full abolition would not come until 1827. So you have this limbo period for people because of the Emancipation Act, and there were hopes there. But you're going to talk about what really happened. Different community organizations formed during this period, but there was an ever-present fear of re-enslavement. And Zachary's going to talk about that, the growing access to education, what there was or wasn't of that education. He started his journey looking at how the actions of the New York Manumission Society, the African Free School, and the Free African Society for Mutual Relief contributed to the establishment of vibrant Black churches and Black neighborhoods, some of which are still extant today. I mention that because research like this impacts our current partnerships. We actually work with a lot of Black churches in Westchester, and they're going to be so excited to read this research, to read about it, to see it online, to derive more information and education from it. The civic organizations that Zach studied were not solely vehicles for political expression. They helped Black New Yorkers articulate and enact their newfound freedom by providing aid, legal defense, education, and spiritual and social support. Drawing from primary documents from the Manumission Society, Zachary is going to share a few vignettes from the real lives of Black New Yorkers, presenting a realistic, both hopeful and somber portrait of this important moment of transportation. So what does he do when he's not taking on a topic of that enormous size? This past summer, Zachary also conducted research at Columbia's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory on extreme heat in the Midwest. Again, these students are with it, timely. He is helping to evaluate the risks of extreme climate on a variety of sectors, including public health, energy, and agriculture, with an underlying focus on climate justice. In addition, he is the chief engineer and previous director of operations for WKCR-FM New York 89.9 FM. Listen to that radio station. There he hosts a weekly jazz radio show, Wednesday, 6 to 9, tune in, where he profiles a single bop or hard bop musician based on personal research. All right, so Wena, we're going to start off with you and give you a round of applause.
Hello everyone, my name is Wena Teng, and welcome to the JHC Center. I'm a senior at Columbia University studying history with a specialization in political economy and race ethnicity studies on the pre-law track, and that all just means that I study money, people, and labor. Researching the contingencies of our nation's political economy, which became a roller coaster of a 4-part story I will soon tell, it's quite a mess, but I'm struck by how this project came together as a result of the extraordinary support and generosity of JHC, mentors, friends, and family. I'm incredibly honored to be in the second cohort of the Margaret, Nolan O'Neill Fellows. It has been my absolute pleasure to work with Suzanne, Meredith, Zachary, Sumana, Kiki, Michael, Shannon, and all of the members and friends of the JHC team who I have met during my research this summer. As O'Neill Fellow, I have spent this summer studying John Jay's role and tensions with the opening of the US-China trade in the early republic and what this history can tell us about the evolution of nation building and the shaping of our nation's economic and political values. I strive also to tell a story of the margins, of the silence in the archives of Chinese labor communities who played a major role in this nation building. Thank you sincerely to Suzanne for pushing my thinking in new directions, thinking dialectically, questioning the silence of the archives, and engaging in an intimate history shared through human relationships. Born and raised in New York as a first-generation Chinese American to two immigrants, this project sincerely means a lot to me. This project would not be possible with the O'Neill family and their friends, who I want to personally thank for providing me with the opportunity to pursue these questions inherent to my identity. This research gave me every excuse to go to Chinatown, to research alongside pineapple buns and Chinese tea in my favorite cafes, trek down to forbidden NYU territory for the tenement library and Wagner labor archives, and encouraged me to explore a part of early American history that a 20th century historian would quite frankly be terrified of. I would also like to thank my research advisor, Professor Mei Nai, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because she's on a book tour, but I'm deeply grateful for her to pushing the boundaries of my imagination and critical thinking. I would also like to thank Professor Dorothy Ko for sparking my first love for Chinese history beyond the binaries of East, West, or traditional modern. Lastly, I want to thank my family who have supported me unconditionally. A special thank you to my mom, Mei Jing-hee, for igniting my first love for scholarship with the stories of her past life as a literature teacher in China, and who delayed her flight to China to be here today. Thank you all to the communities, mentors, friends, and Queens, New York for raising me. Today, I'm going to tell another story about how our country was raised. First, we'll examine the Treaty of Paris and the formation of the early republic, how foreign policy and trade with China allowed early republic figures, including John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and more, to imagine and construct the American identity in its early stages. We will then discuss the opening of trade with China, the factional divides between the Federalists and the Jefferson Republicans, and the tensions between manufactured and agricultural labor. Through this, we will look at how the new union reckoned with the abolition of enslaved labor and explore the nuances of the coolie trade and its subsequent mutual aid institutions and self-sustaining economies. And finally, we will end by examining the legacy of the trades of goods and people. Where are the ethnic laborers communities today, and what can this teach us about US-China relations, labor law, immigration policy? To start, John Adams was not a happy vacationer in Paris in the mid-July of 1783. He was also not a vacationer but was in the French capital to negotiate a war-ending treaty and peace settlement with Great Britain, a task that he had found extremely frustrating because 2 weeks prior, Britain had issued a significant trade proclamation that re-emphasized the empire's commitment to start trade with the British West Indies again, but restricted this trade to British subjects only, and this was post-independence. Adams recognized this as a critical threat to American economic development, and his concern was twofold. First, that the traditional outlets for American produce and charters for American ships, and second, the impact on American shipping rights. These restrictions will severely constrain, or as he put it, leave, straighten, and shackle the new nation's economic prospects. Adams, while proposing coordinated state action against British trade restrictions, harbored his own doubts. He acknowledged that even, and I quote, common danger might not achieve perfect unanimity among the states, and ruminated on other ways of making impressions upon the English. Some of his recommendations tell a familiar story about the sad reality of American political economy, growing West Indian products within the United States with enslaved labor, but other recommendations tell another story about the geopolitics of the early revolutionaries, one that reached beyond the Atlantic world, and a story that has been largely more invisible to early American historians. send ships immediately to China, Adams told Congress the same month in 1783, because this trade is as open to us as any nation. His logic was remarkably sophisticated. By establishing an American presence in Asian markets, the United States could either pressure Britain to reopen the Atlantic trade or develop alternative commercial opportunities and assert the presence of the young nation on the international stage. Adams and revolutionaries of his time viewed international trade not merely as commercial activity, but also as an extension of political strategy, with Chinese trade playing a central role in their global vision. And Adams did not have to tell Congress twice, because the start of American-Chinese trade coincided with the nation's independence. When the Continental Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris and officially ended the Revolutionary War, it took just over a month in February of 1784 for the first American ship to set sail for Canton, or in Chinese, Guangzhou. As the winter ice cleared from New York's harbor, the Empress of China, a modest, square-sterned vessel, began its historic journey. This ship carried more than its physical cargo of ginseng and Chinese silver dollars, tea, and opium, but was loaded with symbolic significance for the new nation. The venture was financed by influential merchants from Philadelphia and New York, including Robert Morris, who had served as the Continental Congress's Superintendent of Finance and was operated by well-known and respected Revolutionary War veterans. The Empress represented America's aspirations for economic success in this post-war era. When the Empress had departed, the United States was facing severe economic distress following its independence. The Revolutionary War had exacted a heavy toll in both human and material costs, so it left state governments and the Continental Congress deeply indebted. The weak nation's government established under the Articles of Confederation lacked basic powers to address those challenges, including taxation, trade regulation, and foreign relations. By early 1784, the economic implications of separation for Britain had become starkly apparent to them. While American merchants lost access to vital Indian ports, British and continental trades maintained unfettered access to American markets, and this overwhelmed domestic commerce. American elites viewed Chinese commerce as a vital element of their new nation's economy. What they called the China trade, or trade with the East Indies, wasn't just direct commerce to China, but rather a participation in a very intricate network of trade connecting Asian ports, especially Canton, with markets across multiple continents. Leading American figures at this time saw the commerce again as a way to grow economic power while maintaining and asserting independence in line with early republic values. The focus on Chinese trade influenced how American leaders argued for a stronger central government and shaped its key institutions. This was particularly evident in the federal tariff system, which specifically protected goods imported from China or India, and it was a crucial source of national government funding, which will begin to have a tension between the Jefferson Republicans and the Federalists, which John Jay was part of. The Emperor's journey was part of this larger and broader initiative to address these challenges of nation building and defining key institutions of the new nation's political, economic, and international capabilities through commercial expansion. American merchants had developed global trading networks to acquire necessary items for Chinese commerce, collecting diverse commodities: ginseng from Appalachia, furs from the Pacific Northwest and South America, Hawaiian sandalwood, opium from Bengal, and Spanish silver dollars from various American and European trading partners. This often resulted in American merchants conducting multi-year voyages worldwide rather than simply having direct routes to China, and this again created the sense of new international interconnection for the new country. The extensive international engagement required for Canton trade elevated status both as a gateway to global commerce and a voyage of private prestige. Americans were very well aware of Europeans' powerful East Indian companies and their monopolistic structures. These companies accumulated wealth and power, and Chinese goods themselves carried significant importance, particularly tea, which maintained its essential role in American consumption, even serving as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance in the Boston Tea Party. Tea, along with Chinese textiles, porcelains, and furniture, function as a crucial signifier of social standing in the private life as well. Moreover, China itself held intrinsic appeal for Americans. Americans viewed China at this time, with its large population, agricultural power, and sophisticated transportation infrastructure, as a potential model for their developing republic. The motivations for American participation in China trade was thus multifaceted. It would demonstrate Americans' commercial capabilities, meet domestic demand, and establish connections with one of the world's most advanced societies at the time, while avoiding increased dependence on Atlantic powers. The emperor's successful return on May 11, 1785, with a cargo of teas, silk, cotton, and porcelain generated celebratory commentary. This praise was motivated in part by how closely Americans identified this expansion of trade with escape from the shackles of British mercantilism. The President of Congress, Richard Henry Lee, filled his letters that spring with news of the emperor's arrival, gleefully describing it as a proof of American enterprise that will probably mortify as much as it will injure our old oppressors, the British. Editor and poet Philip Furneur later celebrated the voyage in verse. Would anyone like to have a stab at reading this? Stephen Wei, you want to? Go for it, or whatever.
Okay. She spreads her wings to meet the sun, those golden regions to explore, where George forbade to sail before, thus grown to strength the bird of love, of Jove, impatient quits his native grove, with eyes of fire and lightning's force, through the blue aether holds his course, no foreign tars are here allowed.
Thank you. Philip Furneur, on the first American ship that explored the route to China and the East Indies after the Revolution, published in 1784, which marked the voyage of the Empress of China. He was a proud American revolutionary and so equally proud of the voyage while not missing a chance to bash the British. A poetic demonstration of Americans' liberation from the mercantilist confines of the British Empire. Congress, as well as a body, also congratulated the sailors, expressing peculiar satisfaction in this first effort of the citizens of America to establish a direct trade with China. The significance of Chinese trade for American global standing was confirmed through reports from the Emperor's journey. Our new character, Samuel Shaw, a distinguished Continental Army veteran and who served as a supercargo on this trip, promptly submitted an official report to Congress in the form of a letter to John Jay on May 19, 1875, upon returning to New York. It's incredibly important to note that his account emphasized diplomatic relations rather than of trade mechanics, drawing Jay's attention to the diplomatic tensions of the different nations converging in Canton, but also of the diplomatic possibilities. He writes, "The other occurrence of which I beg leave to take notice give rise to what was commonly called the Canton War, which threatened to be productive of very serious consequences on the 25th of November on an English ship, in saluting some company that had died on board, killed a Chinese, and wounded 2 others, in the Mandarin's boat alongside. It is a maxim of the Chinese law that blood must answer for blood, in pursuance of which they demanded the unfortunate gunner. To give up this poor man was to consign him to certain death. Humanity pleaded powerfully against the measure after repeated conferences between the English and the Chinese. The latter declared themselves satisfied, and affair was supposed to be entirely settled, to which then he continues by explaining how it was not in fact settled, and the gunner unfortunately died." Regarding interactions of Chinese merchants, Shaw emphasized their reception of Americans, writing that the Chinese were very indulgent towards us, and that they styled us as a new people. Shaw's hints of diplomacy, and I think he was trying to hint at John Jay to give him a job here, went outside just the Chinese, as he noted that Americans also received assistance from our good allies, the French, who facilitated their integration into Canton's foreign merchant company. The English were also receptive and on good behavior to the Americans as well. The success of the Emperor straightened John Adams' early conviction about the strategic importance of Chinese trade. Adams believed that this intelligence gathered through the trade would serve as a valuable diplomatic leverage during future European conflicts. And this is an image of the 13 factory system in the shore of Canton. It gives almost United Nations, but in the later 19th century. And this is Ellen Amira Lowe Pierrepont, who was Abel Abbott Lowe's daughter and Seth Low, who was the president and mayor of New York City, president of Columbia University and mayor of New York City, as well's sister. Abel Abbott Low funded received a lot of his money through the opium trade, and that was how a lot of the money that the Low family had was from. And Low Library at Columbia University is built in memoriam of Abel Abbott Low, whose daughter Ellen married into the Pierrepont family, which is a direct descendant of John Jay. With the Empress opening the door for trade, Part 2 will now address John Jay and other advocates for a stronger national government, and how other advocates for stronger national government mobilized reports like Shaw's to promote their cause. Signed in New York City on January 30th, 1786, 2 years into his 5-year-long term as U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Jay opened a letter that streamlined trade of China by appointing the first U.S. consul to China, Samuel Shaw. So he did, in fact, get the job as the first U.S. consul to China. He writes, "It will not be necessary for me to dwell on the advantages your country may derive from the information you may acquire. Permit me, however, to request a favor of your correspondence, and that you will transmit to me by proper conveyance whatever intelligence and observations you think may be conducive to the public good." Reminding us of the diplomatic intelligence Shaw highlighted and Eric Adams also highlighted in his reports a year before. 3 years after Shaw concluded his first voyage to China, Jay wrote in the Federalist Papers of the need to partake in advantages which they had in a manner monopolized. For Jay, China was not to solely further Americans' economic prosperity, but it also served as a vessel to secure an independent market where the newly constituted nation could demonstrate its sovereignty through trade, particularly the tea trade. In the very first note of the pro-Constitution Federalist Papers, Jay predicted that the enterprise and the address of our merchants and navigators will enable Americans to gain a substantial portion of Western Chinese trade. He worried that this commercial success might provoke military conflict with European nations, and this was a concern that echoed Shaw's apprehensions, and used this fear to explain why he believed the only effective defense against this threat would be a stronger central government and a robust naval force. The two, according to Jay, would be best established under the proposed Constitution's more powerful federal system, which the Federalist Papers also exemplified. As the first era of American-China trade opened, John Jay also drew parallels between the expansion of commerce and the American westward settlement. In his 1787 letter to Thomas Jefferson, Jay remarked on the enterprise of our countrymen is inconceivable, specifically mentioning both the growing East Indies trade and the number of young swans daily going down to settle in the Western country. However, while Jay grouped these two examples of American expansion together, he also expressed particular concern about one. He worried that the Western country will one day give us trouble. To govern them would not be easy, and a reservation he notably did not extend to the flourishing Chinese trade. Jay's distinction between westward versus overseas expansion foreshadowed a fundamental split that will emerge in American politics. Different notions of what kind of political economy and political culture would best support the new nation's fragile republican institutions. The 1790s would be marked by competing visions about which economic and cultural approaches will best sustain the new republic's vulnerable institutions, including enslaved labor, which John Jay advocated to abolish. The Federalists had been consistent supporters of Chinese trade since America gained independence. Some Federalists, including Jay, again used the challenges by American merchants in Asia as an argument for ratifying the Constitution. This support transformed from words into policy during Washington's first year as president, where Congress implemented protective tariffs that gave American traders exclusive rights to import Asian goods for domestic markets, and Hamilton's Treasury Department offered favorable tax payments to other arrangements to tea merchants. In contrast, among those who formed the opposition party developed gradually, emerging alongside the Republican coalition in response to new ideas in the 1790s. The opposition's key leaders, Jefferson and Madison, weren't initially champions of China trade. The early writings from the 1780s and early 1970s had mentioned China primarily in more philosophical terms, typically using it as a symbol of economic self-sufficiency or authoritarian rule. Jefferson and Madison's support for commercial regulations in foreign policy was more conceptual than practical regarding China trade, as John Jay and the Federalists had. The China trade was also not a primary concern for their supporters, who were generally democratic artisans and farmers. The Jay Treaty controversy in 1794 also brought this split up to the forefront. In 1794, John Jay was sent to London to negotiate an end to the vexations and captures suffered by American settlers at British hands and to resolve remaining points of difference from the 1783 peace treaty. Jay's mission including securing U.S. access to East Indies and the Caribbean. The resulting treaty, signed in November 1794, was not widely popular in the United States because while it did address boundary disputes and Anglo-American trade relations, when the treaty terms became public in 1795, it faced significant criticism from its Article 13, which concerned American access to British territories in the East Indies. Supporters, including Jay, had claimed that this act normalized a trade that had previously existed only by sovereigns, changing the mere indulgence of colonial administrators into a secure legal right for the new republic. Republicans argued that the apparent concession in Article 13 of the Jay Treaty regarding American access to British ports in Asia was misleading. They pointed that the Americans had already been trading freely at these ports for years and bringing in demand goods like spices, provisions, and naval stores. However, Article 13 did not formalize existing practices. Instead, to Jefferson and Madison and the Jeffersonian Republicans, it introduced new restrictions that threatened to severely limit this trade. Specifically, it, 1, banned Americans from engaging in coastal trade between East Indian colonies, limited the goods Americans could export from these ports during wartime, and required that U.S. vessels only export goods from British Asia to some port or place in America, rather than allowing them to continue to other markets like Canton. These new restrictions disrupted the established patterns of American China trade. Republican critics emphasized that American stops at British Asian ports were just one part of a more complex trading routes focused on more profitable markets. For example, they described how Americans could carry salted provisions to Bombay, where they'd taken cotton and shark fins on freight to China, which allowed them to lay in a return cargo to its greatest advantage. In February 1802, Teng, a political economist aware of Jefferson's administration goals to reduce American dependence on British manufactured goods, proposed an alternative solution. He suggested to use China as a potential source of manufacturers. Cook's proposal aligned with the administration's objectives and recognizing that American self-sufficiency in manufacturing was a distant goal, and that he believed finding alternative sources was a more practical approach. Drawing on common Orientalist views, he highlighted China's cheapness of living and labor and the intimate talents of the country and its people as advantages. He argued that European manufacturers had intentionally limited Chinese imports to protect their interests, but that the United States, lacking a developed manufacturing sector, could benefit from this trade without conflict. And as I said before, the 1790s would be marked by competing visions about which economic and cultural approaches would be best used to sustain the new republic's vulnerable institutions, including enslaved labor, which John Jay had sought to abolish. How then to account for the Chinese labor smuggled into the nation alongside ginseng, tea, fur, and opium? This next part will explore how Chinese labor complicates this political economy and political culture that had best supported the new nation's fragile republican institutions, especially after emancipation. Chinese labor was not available at first. And a question of trade once more, China during the Qing dynasty refused to trade with the West and maintained strict anti-immigration laws. China's closed doors was smashed by the Nanking Treaty in 1843, which had ended the Opium War. China seceded Hong Kong to the British and opened 5 additional Chinese seaports to trade: Canton, Guangzhou, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuchao, Fuzhou, Ningpo, Ningbo, and Shanghai. With these ports open, the Chinese government could no longer control the movements of its nationals. and it had already estimated that during the period from 1847 to 1874, between 250,000 to 500,000 Chinese laborers were shipped from Amoy, Canton, and Hong Kong to the plantations in Cuba, Peru, Chile, and the Sandwich Islands alone. From 1847 to 1862, American shippers too also engaged in extensive quote-unquote coolie labor while trading material goods familiar to the early republic, including opium, tea, ginseng, and fur. Some of the ships used in the coolie trade were the same vessels used for the early business of African enslaved labor. In 1865, the same year enslaved labor was abolished, the Memphis Daily Appeal reintroduced the idea of the importation of Chinese laborers to the South in order to replace vacant labor. On July 13, 1869, 500 businessmen and large landowners from across the Mississippi Delta were commenced by the Memphis Chamber of Commerce to discuss the possibility of contracting Chinese laborers. The delegations formed a joint stock company called the Mississippi Valley Immigration Company from their 3-day convention, which the appeal coined the Chinese Labor Convention. Subsequently, in 1873, members of the Chinese Six Companies, a Chinese merchants' confederation in San Francisco, admitted that they had imported workers as quote-unquote coolies in the early years of the gold rush in the 1850s. By then, there had already been an estimated 48,000 Chinese laborers in the United States, and most of them worked in mines. Most of the laborers were hired through a contract system that obligated them to work for employers who sponsored them for 7 years. The laborers, again, were called quote-unquote coolies, and I'd like to take a second here to acknowledge the evolution of this word and its derogatory connotations. The origins of the term is not exactly clear, but it might have come from the Tamil word koli, to hire, or a Hindi word for hired servants, adopted by the Europeans to describe workers doing heavy labor, and then translated phonetically into Chinese characters meaning bitter labor. A person subjected to hard and exploitative labor. In Chinese, if you can 吃苦, that means you can take bitterness and you're able to do harsh labor. Yet, as my research advisor, Professor Mei Nai, argues in her book, The Chinese Question, the coolie myth is insidious because it alleges that Chinese immigrants were pitifully oppressed without individual personality or will, and they were pawns of big capitalists used to replace enslaved labor. It also continued to reinforce the racial capitalism and narrative used to justify enslaved labor. The Chinese were deemed a special racialized version of cheap labor, which justified later exclusion laws. In this part, I strive to reconcile the tensions between Chinese labor as a means to replace enslaved labor, but also with the agency that Chinese laborers who developed complex transnational systems of kinship and mutual aid institutions also had. And these are two truths that coexisted. Despite the Chinese providing new labor, the nation, as it did in the late 18th century, had to reckon with its new developments. China, Chinese goods, and Chinese labor, articulated in what politicians and scholars alike call the Chinese question, once again created a new layer in the country's political economy, but this time it was through an intervention of racial capitalism. Henry George, a prominent philosopher and political economist at this time, expanded on anti-Chinese labor laws, bringing them to the national attention. His analysis set Chinese immigrants apart from other immigrant groups whose cheaper labor he viewed only as a temporary phenomenon. George argued that European immigrants would eventually assimilate into the American working class, and the Chinese were unassimilable and a perpetual other. In contrast, George claimed that Chinese labor will cause a general and permanent wage reduction. As part of the public consensus, George repeated common stereotypes about Chinese immigrants, portraying them as one, unclean and untrustworthy, ignorant of Christian values and American political institutions, bound by a contract system enforced by the Chinese Six Companies, which he likened to enslaved labor, and unwilling to form trade unions or advocate for workers' rights. Due to these perceived characteristics, George argued that Chinese workers were the ideal labor force for large capitalists, as they could not resist exploitation or demand better conditions. As it did in the late 1780s and 1790s, the Chinese question, this time defined through racial scapegoating, revealed new political and economic tensions in our nation's development. Yet I want to shift this talk now to a part of history we should try to revise. Chinese workers contracted to work mainly in the mines and to physically, literally carved and built the West, developed their own political and economic systems of mutual power, support, entrepreneurship, and transnational networks. Chinese immigrants in the gold mining regions developed unique economic strategies while also integrating into the broader gold rush economy before using the wealth accumulated to build elaborate associations and community life. Contrary to the popular image of the lone, rugged prospector, gold mining was typically a group endeavor. Chinese miners frequently formed partnerships and other collective arrangements to work their claims. The mining cooperatives emphasized a strong egalitarian ethic and often built on foundations of shared native origins and kinship ties. In a sense, these cooperative structures could be viewed as a form of refuge from or even resistance to the emerging capitalist wage labor system. This cooperative approach was not unique to Chinese laborers, but was also a common practice across various ethnic groups in the gold fields. These group efforts allowed miners to pool resources, share labor, and potentially increase their chances of success. American Mining Census reports documented various Chinese mining operations, including companies with names like John China Placer Mining Company and the Hong Kong China Wing Dam Company. These enterprises were either owned or leased and typically employed 10 to 20 workers. The organizational structure of these companies often involved a local merchant who acquired or leased the claim, provided equipment, and recruited miners. Instead of paying wages, however, these companies operated on a profit-sharing model. The merchant investor received a portion of the output, while the miners divided the remainder amongst themselves. And cooperatives also worked based on shares, but with equal shares for both profits and expenses, and they typically had no boss or headman. In one story that circulated widely amongst the Chinese, a group had found and chiseled a 40-pound nugget into small pieces so that each man could have his share. This information challenges the conventional narrative that Chinese miners only worked on depleted claims, abandoned or had been sold by white miners, or that they took jobs from white laborers. Instead, it suggests a more diverse and entrepreneurial approach to mining across Chinese immigrants, who built these self-sustained economies amidst the developments of their new nation struggling with political and economic tensions. By 1856, 1,000 Chinese lived in China Camp, right there on the right, a gold rush era town, and at its peak, China Camp and its surrounding area supported a population of 5,000 Chinese. While most of the residents were gold miners, they also had a diverse population including merchants, service providers, and various tradespeople. A vegetable garden and fish pond provided fresh ingredients for traditional Chinese diets, and prominent merchants held significant assets, with some Chinese merchant houses earning up to $100,000 annually by the mid-1860s. The town's cultural importance was evident in its 4 native place associations, Huiguan, and 3 temples, demonstrating the community's economic success and its aims at cultural preservation. The Sun Wu store in Counterville, California, for example, functioned from 1851 to 1926, and the structures remain standing today. Obviously not as pristine, though, as the JHC Center. The Chinese sold diverse goods to miners, including sugar, whiskey, and candles, canvas and cotton, rope, nails, sledges, dynamite, ham, canned oysters, salmon, and eggs. They also offer Chinese goods, including black beans, salted fish, lychee, herbal medicine, opium, green tea, and ritual items. Chinese merchants, like Wan Pi, gained prosperity and influence among local miners, often acting as liaisons with white businesses. However, the most powerful Chinese merchants were based in major cities, particularly in San Francisco, where Yuan Sheng, an early Chinese immigrant to San Francisco, established the Macau restaurant and his own trading company. These businesses became vital in supporting Chinese diasporic communities, and similarly, Chen Lei founded Jinlong, which grew to be the largest and most renowned Chinese business in the city. He exemplified the success of trans-Pacific merchants who imported $10,000 worth of Chinese goods at a time and sold them rapidly. His San Francisco-based company expanded to include branches in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Yokohama. Some merchants even acquired their own ships or became shipping agents, which further solidified their role in the trans-Pacific trade. So the story from part 1 to part 2, part 3 evolves where instead of having American sellers engage in this trans-Pacific trade, the coolie trade, which was conventionally in history called relegated to the silence of the archives and considered cheap labor, actually evolved to the point where Chinese folks and laborers were now engaging in this trans-Pacific trade themselves and building these institutions of mutual aid, economic success, and these self-sustained economic institutions. And Chinese laborers and merchants also participated in political life amongst themselves and with American leaders. Yuan Sheng, for example, was a founding member and the first president of the Young Bull Association, representing immigrants from Zhongshan County, which is Taishan in Guangzhou Canton. Wealthy men like Yuan Sheng and Cheng Le's social influence was situated in two networks. First, with their connections to the American political and business leaders of the city, and by extension to the state, and more importantly, their position at the top of their organizations of the Huiguan. Huiguans were mutual aid organizations based on common regional origins, similarly to those formed by various other immigrant groups. These associations dated back to China's Ming Dynasty and were first established when the Chinese immigrated. The first California Huiguans, CU Company and Xiangyi Huiguan, were organized in 1852, with both of them gaining significant influence due to its cosmopolitan merchant membership. Huiguans also provided crucial support for these new immigrants. They offered them lodging, meals, job information, and various other services. They also represented the Chinese community to white society and handled legal matters. While some European Americans misunderstood Huiguans as company or organizations, Chinese immigrants themselves view their memberships as an essential part of their trust networks based on shared origins and clan ties. And this is really fascinating because of this understanding that transnationalism is not something that is just created through blood ties, but also this idea as you're going from country to country, this idea of a social constructed sense of kinship and transnationalism. And in 1882, California Huiguan established a coordinating organization called the Zhonghua Huiguan, officially known as the Chinese Benevolent Association and referred to as the Six Chinese Companies. Similarly, associations were also organized by immigrants from Xiamen, Amoy in Fujian's province, demonstrating the widespread of these organizations across various different Chinese diasporic communities. Huiguans also served dual roles as organizations of solidarity and social control for Chinese immigrants. Upon arrival in America, new immigrants would be met from the representatives of these Huiguans, who provided immediate assistance, including lodging, meals, and again, job information. These associations, however, also collected debt payments and had remittance systems, resolved disputes, cared for sick members, and handled burial arrangements. Huiguan's leaders also represented the Chinese community beyond the enclave, again participating in public discourse and legal matters. The variety of Chinese mining practices, entrepreneurship, and the development of these sites of home, community, and mutual support challenges this rigid 19th century categorization of labor as either free or unfreed, and this binary distinction typically separated independent and wage-earning labor from enslaved labor. However, the realities of Chinese miners' experiences doesn't neatly or perfectly fit into either of these categories. It's important to note that Chinese miners were not unfree in the conventional sense. They were not held as property, they were not denied wages for their work or prevented from leaving or relocating. And these conditions are conditions typically associated with bound labor. Those who worked independently in partnerships or in egalitarian cooperatives enjoyed considerable, and if not complete, agency. And so in telling a story about trade, cargo, US-China relations, I try my best not to generalize or to find different parallels between various different contingencies. But I wanted to talk about the afterlives of free trade from the beginnings of open trade with John Jay, John Adams, the Federalists, and the Jeffersonian Republicans to the afterlife of trade today. On June 6, 1993, 150 cargo ship ran aground in Rockaway Beach called the Golden Venture Crash. And essentially there were Chinese men from southern China, same locations as the one that had came through the quote-unquote coolie trade in the mid-19th century. And it ran aground in Rockaway Beach and was this entire thing in the Bill Clinton's administration, which again forced America and the United States to reckon with its political economy and its institutions of political and economy. And instead, the question was, should these bachelors, these new immigrants, be allowed into the United States, or should they be detained and deported back to China? I think this is a really interesting case to me, and for me finds a lot of relevance to the coolie trade and the use of mutual aid institutions that arise from these moments of crisis, because while the Hart-Celler Act in 1965 allowed for immigrants to come into the U.S. from Asia, they were particularly through work visas, folks who were doctoral students or who had professional occupations. A lot of these folks who came to the U.S. Were similarly smuggled through and occupied low-wage or low-skilled laborers. And this is an exact resistance to the idea of the model minority myth, which was not measured, which defines this idea that Asian Americans are, through their proximity to Americanness, are these model minorities who then can be used to sow division amongst other communities of color. And I think this was particularly interesting to me because it's this ability to imagine a new identity through sites of community, of mutual aid, and of informal labor economies. The immigrants, some of them were deported back to China, but some of them were allowed to reside in ethnic enclaves around New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and created a lot of these same institutions that we talked about during the mid-19th century. Much of the organizations from the 19th century are still in existence today in San Francisco, in New York, and a lot of new ones had also arisen, with a lot of emerging labor organizations led by Asian Americans like COV and domestic workers and Asian Americans advancing justice. It shows this evolution of the mutual aid organizations that had started through the smuggling of folks from China through the early republic to the coolie trade and now. And so I think it's really important to address to approach U.S.-China relations and to approach immigration not from a reactory approach to immigration, but rather understanding of how these economies, self-sustained economies, these mutual aid institutions, and these ethnic enclaves are also integral to the way that we see political economy from the early republic to now. Though there are a lot of tensions regarding political economy and the various institutions that immigrants themselves occupy, it's this understanding that there doesn't have to be a separation between the conventional labor and the way we imagine mutual aid institutions today. And from a young age, I learned how to navigate these ideas of law and policy through the in-between of translation. And I think that's the best way we should approach law, history, and policy, is that it is rested and nested between these stunning gaps of language translation, and that we can reconcile these gaps and contradictions in American history, American geopolitics, and American law by building from these historical foundational knowledge and being able to have this radical imagination to imagine the parallels and the evolution of mutual aid societies and of history, and constructing comparative connections for global progress. Laws, policies, and histories are seemingly static in their invariable applications, but they are actually ever changing through critical reasoning and the reconciliation of diverse groups, peoples, and culture. And as we approach these questions now, very timely, with questions about legal personhood, about immigration policy, labor law, and U.S.-China tensions, it's important not to have these generalizations of the different contingencies of these different 4 periods, but to see the ways that we define mutual aid and the ways that we can define these ideas and imagine these ideas of legal personhood, of mutual aid, and being in relation with one another. Thank you so much.
order is that we ask 2 questions of Wena, and then take a break, and then we're going to come back and hear Zachary. And then we're going to have a reception after all this where we can ask lots of questions, but we'll take just like 2 quick questions now, right? Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Did you mention anything about conflict caused by political geography?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you mentioned that.
In current terms or in
China, Taiwan, the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the way that I imagine U.S.-China politics, the tensions with U.S., Taiwan, China, is this understanding that there are, separate from these larger institutions of government, of political economy, of political federal governments and federal policies and laws, there's more, we can use these communities of Asian Americans, of Chinese Americans, Taiwanese Americans as a site of scholarship instead of just looking at policies or the law that is from a top-down approach, looking at the communities themselves as a way of mutual aid, of support, and the ways that they are able to navigate the tensions that they have with their identity, their home country, and this new reckoning with U.S. politics and U.S. law.
Ben.
I was curious in part 1 of your discussion, you talked a lot about the early American trade in the West Indies and that relationship with British power. Because the United States hadn't sort of manifest destiny its way all the way to California, how were those ships getting to China? Were they using British ports? Were they going around Africa? What did that sort of look like at that time?
Yeah, I don't have too much information about that. I mainly looked at the correspondence between John Jay and Samuel Shaw and the various factory owners in Canton. But as I mentioned, it wasn't just direct commerce or journey to China, but rather part of this more elaborate international network of going to Latin America, to Bengal, to Hawaii, to the various different places. And that's why I was particularly interested in the U.S.-China trade, because this isn't a story about U.S.-China trade relations, but a story about how this early republic was able to assert itself amongst this more international stage and the various different players and locations and sites that they had to navigate in between from their individual countries, internal tensions, but also part of this more larger global stage.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So we're going to take a break, please. 5-minute break. Grab a glass of water, stretch, and then we'll come back for Zachary's presentation. And we'll have more questions after both presentations.
Hello and welcome. I'm Zachary Vanderslice. Welcome to my talk, In Limbo, Black Life Between Freedom and Slavery During Gradual Abolition. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my thanks to a few people. First and foremost, the O'Neill family. It's been really special to be here, both intellectually and to be able to work in the archives, but also just to be in this space, and your support has made that possible, and I would have loved to have met her as well. Second, I'd like to thank the JHC Center, its board, its volunteers, and most importantly, the assistance of Suzanne and Meredith, who've worked with me as this project has evolved and moved in numerous different directions, and their patience and support has been deeply important. I'd like to thank my co-fellows and the other interns that were here this summer for their discussions with me about the project. And I'd like to thank my advisor, Christopher Brown, who couldn't be here today, but has been really important in guiding this project and other work beyond. First, a few things about myself. First, I'm normally more formally dressed, but forgot a pair of pants on the way, but left a pair of pants on the way here. And so if you'll indulge me in pretending that we're on Zoom today, I would appreciate that. I'm a senior at Columbia University. I focus mainly on the history of the Atlantic world, and I study applied math, which will seep its way in here a little bit. I also do work on climate change in the Midwest, as Suzanne mentioned. My talk today is on a very special moment in New York history and the history of the United States as well. New York State, as we're going to learn, began to abolish slavery in 1799. It began by freeing those born after July 4th of that year. And that process of gradual emancipation continued until 1827, when all the slaves were freed. In 1799, Black New Yorkers did not know when abolition would come, just that it would. For many, freedom would come only for their children, and even then only partially. Those born July 3rd missed freedom by only a day. bested by the cruel randomness of fate. My talk asks, what did it mean to know that freedom was inevitable, but maybe not for you? Throughout, I want us to keep in mind two things about this period that I think are highlighted well by these two images. These are both from the African Free School. And the image on the left of the emblem of the United States, the seal, the eagle, is a good symbol of the possibilities of this period. What is new, what is changing, and the newfound freedoms. It highlights the growth of liberty. The drawing on the right of a thorny rose helps us remind us of the precarity and the pain that this period brought. That even with freedom at its center, grabbing too hard maybe didn't make it possible. In recent years, historians have made much of the new possibilities of this period, highlighting mutual aid societies, churches, and neighborhoods. And we'll talk about those towards the end of the talk. But I think that without an understanding of the precariousness of these new freedoms, we lose sight of what those organizations are really doing. It's not just a political statement, but a desire to actually make oneself safe. You form a neighborhood so that you can not have to worry about your children being kidnapped from inside of your own home. My talk today is organized into three parts. We're going to begin with a chapter with a short background about slavery and its abolition. We're going to move quickly there, answering how important was slavery in New York, and then why gradual emancipation? Why not just abolition in 1799? And then we're going to move to the crux of this talk, which is, was that freedom secure? What was precarious about it? And that will result from a wide reading of the Archives of the Manumission Society, led by and founded by John Jay. And then we'll conclude with a little bit about the possibilities of this period. We're going to highlight two strategies, emigration and education, as ways that New Yorkers reacted to the precariousness of this period and attempted to secure their own freedom. So this first chapter, the rise and fall of slavery in New York, 1626 to 1799. Necessarily have to move a little quickly here. But slavery has a long history in New York. Slaves were first imported to the colony in 1626 by the Dutch, and the trade grew under the British in its first period. By the 18th century, New York possesses one of the largest slave populations in the whole Union. They have the largest urban slave population, second only to Charleston, although Charleston has a much larger population of slaves, and the largest state of slaves in all of the North. That population number is about 10 to 20% of the population, which is much smaller than it is in the South, but it's a significant number. And as we'll notice in some maps in a second, that it's ubiquitous. That last fact, that most people own slaves, should remind us that this is a period in which slavery is common, it's normal, and it's an expectation of interactions in the period. And that will explain in part why strategies of gradual abolition are attempted rather than full abolition. So this map here is a map of slaveholding in New York State and shows us the number of households that own slaves. I want to call attention to a couple things, that the concentration of slavery is most along the Hudson River, and then also in New York County and Kings County, which is where our focus is going to be. That's in part because the New York Manumission Society's archives speak most presently to that area of New York State, but everything we're going to say today can, at some level, be generalized. People who had precarious positions in New York and Kings County, they also had precarious positions in Ulster and Westchester County, and they still attempted to secure their own freedoms. This second map, also provided by Shane White, I should say, demonstrates that slavery this is Manhattan, bottom of the island here, is ubiquitous. It's a large number of households that have slaves in them. You can notice there's a slightly higher concentration along where Whitehall would have been and the ports, which makes sense. And that most people own slaves, as I said earlier, the concentration is most primarily amongst artisans, retailers, and professionals, so semi-skilled labor. These are people who own one or two slaves to assist them in their work. I think there's two things we can notice about this chart and think about it. First is that the New York Manumission Society and other abolitionist organizations face an uphill battle in trying to abolish slavery. Their attempts at abolition, which we'll turn to in a moment, may appear to our modern eyes as half-hearted or contradictory, but I think are a very real reaction to a difficult political situation in which many owned slaves, and it was hard to do more radical approaches in the period. Second, this prevalence of slavery in New York generated intense fears of enslaved revolt. We're not going to talk about it in too much detail, but in 1741, a large number of free black New Yorkers were executed, burned at the stake, for the suspicion of conspiracy. So that kind of fear revolt is also a thing that's present in this period that we're going to talk about in 1799 through 1827. The New York Manumission Society was founded in 1785. In the years after the Revolution, the very basic principles of the Revolution call into question the morality of slavery. And people like John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and many others are thinking about those principles. They're also thinking how to present themselves to other nations. As Wena mentioned, they're talking with France and Britain about how to present themselves as a nation that adheres to its principles. France and Britain are about to abolish slavery. What is America doing in this moment? They're asking themselves. We discussed already why that approach is gradual, and notably, John Jay continues to own slaves in this period. But I don't think we should focus too much on that contradiction, because it's an adaptation to a moving and changing circumstances, and eventually does manumit those slaves, obviously. Importantly, the New York Manumission Society is committed to integrating freed slaves into New York. They found a free African school in 1785, and we're going to talk a lot about the students in that school later on. And that effort of integration into New York is really important to their mission. A short timeline here, then, of abolition. In 1785, when the society is founded, they push really hard for a gradual abolition bill, and as I pointed out, that political circumstance is difficult. They're not able to pass it, and instead pass a smaller bill banning the importation of slaves. In 1788, they're able to ban the export of slaves, and in 1799, they finally passed this gradual emancipation bill, which we'll turn to on the next slide. In 1810, they pass a bill for education that requires that indentured servants learn to read and write. And if they don't by age 21, they'll be freed. In 1817, they pass a bill for full emancipation, which means that in 1827, the slaves will all be freed. So it's a 10-year timeline. So this 1799 bill does a couple things. Most primarily, children born after July 4th are born free. They will in turn have to serve a 25 to 28-year term as indentured servants. It's a partial freedom, but it is freedom, and it gives them new rights and new abilities to sue for their statuses and argue their conditions. While no slaves are directly freed as a result of the law, emancipations and manumissions definitely go up in the period. In 1790, there are 2,000 enslaved people in the city of New York, and by 1810, there are only 1,400 enslaved people in New York. And we'll talk about it later, but it's also a huge growth of free Black New Yorkers who are emigrating into New York. It goes from about a population of 1,000 free Black New Yorkers in 1790 to a population of about 7,000 by 1810. With that understanding of slavery in New York, and that New York is a slave society this period, we can turn to thinking about what the precarity in this period is and what it looks like between 1799 and 1827. I want us to keep in mind this image of the rose and the difficulties that are here. So this section is based on the records of the New York Manumission Society, who met every 2 weeks at their most frequent to discuss cases of illegal enslavement and then to sue on behalf of those people. Their main lawyer is actually included on this chart over here. His name is P.J. Monroe, and the Monroe family donated this portrait as well. And for 20 years, he worked as the main lawyer, suing on behalf of people whose cases the New York Manumission Society saw, and then working with them to help get them free. The committee received a wide variety of different kinds of cases: people who were illegally held in slavery, who'd been illegally imported or exported, people who'd been imprisoned illegally, people who'd been held beyond the terms of their indenturement, and people whose part of estates that had been confiscated and not been freed, and people who'd been manumitted but then not actually freed as a result of the manumission. So here's a picture of those records that I read maybe way too many of. There are 900 pages of material that I've been looking through this summer, and we're going to talk quantitatively about them and with a few, maybe 4 or 5 stories of individuals. You'll note, by the way, that these actually look pretty different. In the early years, they're just paragraphs of cases of individuals, and in the later years, they really have an organized system for managing upwards of 50 cases at a time. So slavery continues in this period, unsurprisingly, because people aren't freed. And in the years after 1799, though, we see a sudden uptick in the New York Manumission Society reporting abuse and cruelty and inhumane treatment. Now, I think it's unreasonable to assume that suddenly owners get worse after 1799. What this indicates, I think, is instead that slaves are aware of the 1799 law. They know that something has changed and that the status of slavery has weakened. It's going to end at some point, and they're doing their level best to attempt to contest their status, to say, hey, we know there isn't actually a law here, but this is horrible, what can you do for me? The New York Manumission Society does its best to work with these people, and is almost always unable to help them because there are no laws in the books that prevent this kind of treatment. They actually do a substantial amount of work to try and pass laws, but are unable to get one passed. Finally, the slave owners tried their best to maintain the institution by continuing to import slaves into the state. So this graph, conducted over from 1792 to 1827, shows the number of imports that are happening into New York. It's from a wide variety of places: New York, New Jersey, the West Indies, a little bit from Africa. And I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that something special happens in 1812 or that it's increasing or decreasing. The Manumission Society meets at different times for different amounts. They're meeting like once a month here, every 2 weeks here, and then like 3 times a year by the end of the period. Rather, I want you to walk away from it noticing that importation continues. People are trying to maintain slavery in this period, and that while it's still fading, and it definitely is, that there are owners who are trying to make it continue. Let's turn now to free Black New Yorkers, who I think are the focus of my project. As I said earlier, they have access to new legal rights and freedoms, and they form Black organizations, mutual aid societies, whose records have often been lost. One of the biggest organizations in this period, founded in 1804, all of its records burned to the ground in 1837. So we don't get to say as much about them as I would love to. There are lots of Black churches founded in this period, and we're actually really intertwined with those mutual aid societies. They're purchasing property. Seneca Village, which maybe you might be familiar with, was founded in the early 1810s, and land purchased for it. That's where Central Park is today. There are also mainly theaters founded in this period of Black work and parades. And in fact, in Albany, for example, there are lots of Africanist parades known as Pinkerton celebrations that are really important in the period. As we'll see, though, that freedom is insecure. And to understand each of those actions, forming neighborhoods and churches and education, we want to think about, well, what are the risks that people are entailing? We're going to highlight 3 ways, as I said above: trickery, imprisonment, and kidnapping, which are going to be tough subjects to work with, but we're going to look at a few individuals and the kind of quantitative picture of what's happening in this period. So that first thing, trickery. The simplest way free people were robbed of their rights was through trickery and subterfuge. While these cases are less prevalent into the archives, and so I don't have a quantitative image to present you here, this means they were necessarily easier to get away with. A couple different things happened. So first, indentured servants were held beyond their term of 25 to 28 years. You might think that, well, those born in 1799 wouldn't have actually ended their term until 1826. But many free Black parents, needing a way to sustain themselves and their children, would bind their children out to work for others as a way of sustaining themselves, often as apprentices in the city. And so they would often not actually be near them. And those relationships were often abused by the heads of these apprenticeships. And occasionally they would hold them beyond the terms, so they would hold them until 25 when the person was supposed to be freed at 18. And in worse circumstances, they would take the person into another state and just move them there because, I don't know, the state or the artisan shop needed to be somewhere else. And in some circumstances, they would take the person into another state and sell them into slavery into Alabama or Savannah or elsewhere. There are too many cases to list here of individuals, of parents coming to the New York Manumission Society saying, I don't actually know what's happened to my kid. I bound them out to someone, but they're gone and I don't know where they are. The second thing here is a slightly smaller section, but is about sailors, which I was really surprised to see in the archives because I don't think about it as super important in this period. But many free Black men in this period work as sailors, and occasionally what would happen is that those sailors would arrive in their destination, let's say Norfolk, Virginia, and then sell them, those apprentices and workers, as slaves in the destination. And in one case that struck with me, a woman who her husband actually owns her. This is a way of being freed functionally. She's not actually manumitted, but her husband owns her. Her husband goes off to war, fights for the U.S. Army, and she's then claimed by someone else as a slave. But the New York Manumission Society can't do anything to assist her because her husband's off, and she has no idea where he is. I mentioned one case here, which is maybe confusing, manumission, as most of the time people are being freed and they're actually being freed. Let's be clear about that. But occasionally it's used as a way to continue bondage. The New York Manumission Society mentions a couple instances in which it's illegal to import slaves into New York. So what traffickers would do is that they say, we'll manumit you and then sign you into a life term of indenturement so that you can legally enter you into the state, but essentially continue into slavery. And this is something that the New York Manumission Society is really aware of and is actually trying to deal with. They're thinking, they're actually technically doing something legal. How do we work with these people? The second kind of precarity here is from imprisonment. You'll see here the old Bridewell or jail in New York. And it resulted when free black people, often while traveling, that is outside of places they were familiar with and new people, would be arrested by local police or persons and then taken to the jail and told to produce papers of freedom. And if they couldn't produce them, they would eventually be sold into slavery. So that's a real limitation on the ability to actually move, and at some level, that's a real right of freedom, is to be able to go outside of the home and do whatever you want and be wherever you want. And that's a limiting factor then. This graph of cases of imprisonment from 1792 to 1827, I wanted to think about in a similar way to the importation here. The point, again, is not that something really changes over the period, that it's increasing, but that it's a continual risk for free black New Yorkers who are moving around and who go to other places. Most of these cases just tell me Jack was held in bondage. He's held in jail. One case I think is useful in remembering here from a man named Edward, who in 1807 was discovered in a jail's dungeon. No one had known about his status, covered with vermin and a state of starvation. He's able to be freed on writ of habeas corpus, thanks to the work of the society. But many of these other people, we don't know the ending of them, whether or not they're able to be freed, and might have endured terrible conditions before they actually get free via the society's work. Finally, we'll turn to what is the most well-documented risk in the archives, kidnapping. Between 1808 and 1827, which are the years that the New York Manumission Society focused on this issue the most, more than 100 people were exported into other states into slavery. The problem reaches its height in 1816, as we'll see, and the society actually forms a committee to deal with this in this period. These records, however, are unclear, often just describing that people were exported, which was illegal regardless of circumstances. So that includes people who were already enslaved being exported out and people who were free being kidnapped from their homes. I want to mark out two cases here that I think are really illustrative. The first is a woman named Jane Dolman in 1807. She's a free woman of color who, when residing in her own home, is taken forcibly off a sickbed by three men unknown, hurried into a carriage, and then brought to Whitehall, the port in the state, and then exported. We lose her status and don't know what happens to her. Another, in 1816, of Isaac Hicks, testified that a couple in his neighborhood, Peter and Mary, had had several of their children claimed and stolen from them by persons whom they knew and who had been bound those children to service, having sold them until they were 28 years of age. And that last case I highlight not because it's especially horrifying, although it is, but to indicate how people understood what was going on. It's parents, so they're thinking about their own children being lost from them. I just can't imagine that kind of pain. But also that the person bringing it to the committee is a man named Isaac Hicks. He's just a neighbor who's talked to the people around him and is aware of what's going on. So when we think about all these kinds of risks, even if it's not happening to you or your family members, it's something that you're aware of and understand is going on between other people around you. This chart of exports indicates a similar thing. I've said earlier that I don't want to think about rises here, but I think there's actually something special happening in 1816. The committee itself, so here it's maybe just because they're not looking for the problem, but in 1816, the Manumission Society says this is actually a real problem right now. There are way more cases that we can come in, and this record here of cases is not a number of people, but just a number of individual cases that they dealt with. So in 1816, for example, when there are a lot larger number, many of those are whole ships of people being taken. I want to conclude this section on precarity by describing one particularly scary and horrifying story from this archive, which we'll move to possibilities in a moment, I promise. The murder of a woman named Hannah. I repeat it not for shock, but because it illustrates what I think is at stake in these cases. We don't know what happens to most of these people exported, just that they aren't at home anymore. So, Hannah's story. On the night of June 19th, 1810, Hannah was kidnapped on the shore of the Hudson River by two men, Samuel P. Adriance and two of his friends. They hire a ferry up the Hudson River for the express purpose of capturing people, and she's taken directly from her husband and children. She's wailing, they tie her, she can't stop screaming, they cut her in the mouth, they leave her in the boat, and only come back later that evening to find her being assisted by others and continuing to scream that she wants to be returned to her family. Then, in order to stop her screams, they begin to give her alcohol. They feed her more and more bottles, and she's dehydrated, having been sat in the hot sun the entirety of the day. She quickly becomes intoxicated and is unable to hold herself up straight. But they leave her below deck. She falls over, her head rolling into the waters where the bilge water collects on the bottom of the deck, and then they weigh her down with stones and throw her overboard. Hannah's story is horrifying, but it is unlikely and exceptional. We only learn of it because the man who steered the ferry for them to do this purpose tells the New York Manumission Society of it. And when we look at a record of people being exported, I don't want to tell you that every single person was murdered, and many of these people were saved by the Manumission Society. But to remind you that a story like Hannah's is something that people would have known about, that people would have had an understanding that friends and family had died in this process, and that we don't know what happened to every single one of these individuals. I'll add that the murderers of Hannah were taken to trial but acquitted of any crimes. The question for me then becomes, what did freedom mean? I've highlighted some, I think, very scary moments in this period, but I don't want us to walk away from this with an understanding of this period as just gloom and somber. The point of highlighting precarity is to let you know that this is what's in the back of people's minds as they decide to do things, right? If you're founding a black neighborhood, you do so because you want real safety. You want to know that the people you know around you are not going to take your children from inside your house. So our third chapter is about emigration and education as two strategies in this period. And returning us to this eagle, we're actually going to look at some more examples of student work. These two strategies are very different necessarily, emigration here referring to emigration to Haiti. And they're not the only strategies. As I've mentioned a couple times now, there are lots of people doing churches and mutual aid societies and other effects. But what I think they get at is a decision either to go or to stay. And those are both very real decisions. And those who are deciding to educate their children and those children who are being educated are making a decision to stay in the city and attempt to secure their freedoms, both for themselves and for others. So when we think about actions like churches, I think we can think about them in the same vein as those who are getting educated in this period. Partly because the churches are also doing those actions. And as we'll see, there's a little bit of connection between these organizations. First, let's talk about emigration as a strategy. So emigration has been a prominent strategy for black freedom in many eras. In New York, it's most famously espoused by the work of Marcus Garvey, who many of you might be familiar with. And in other moments, it was a strategy pushed by white people to remove black people from America. Unsurprisingly, emigration emerges as a strategy in this period. The moments of precarity I've highlighted, I think you might reasonably think, maybe I just need to get out of this place. There's somewhere else to be. Here, it's pushed most primarily by the Haitian government, who's just founding the Republic. And in 1820, they actually reach out to the New York Manumission Society, asking for people to be emigrated to Haiti. And I think in a very interesting moment, the society says, we don't think this is the best strategy. We think that working with education, attempting to secure freedoms is what's really possible in this period. But the New York Manumission Society acknowledges that there are many people that they work with and in their constituency who do want to go. And so they work with a man named Edward Cogan to find and create a list of names. This is only a partial list. It's about 55, 60 people that they collect who are interested in traveling to Haiti and emigrating there. They speak with the government of Haiti, and they eventually send Cogan to Haiti to learn more about what life is like there and if it's going to be possible. If Haiti can support the travel expenses, give those people land. Sadly, this is where we lose the story. Edward Cogan, I am yet to find more evidence of his existence out there. And that's like the part of this research that I'm still excited to continue. And as I mentioned, I'm working on a thesis, and that's where I'm headed, I think, to find out about him. I can say, however, that many people do end up traveling to Haiti, even if we don't know about these individuals' statuses. From the north, thousands travel to Haiti, and a large contingent actually leaves from New York in 1824, and people found societies for this purpose in 1820. Many do end up returning, actually, because the status in Haiti is, the political situation is so rife. There's civil war going on. It's just difficult, and about a third of all who transmitted from the north end up returning. Emigration has often been a controversial strategy, and one historian, Leslie Alexander, has documented how Black New Yorkers argued about it in this period. And no one previously had documented the New York many mission societies' role in this, and I think it illustrates that it's complex, that they're not sure if it makes sense to make a decision about education and staying here and building freedoms, not just for themselves, but for others. And so now when we look at the work of students in the African Free School, I want us to think about it as a conscious decision to actually stay here, when there was a real opportunity to go. The New York African Free School was founded in 1785. Here's a photo or drawing by a student of the second location of the school. And I think it's strongest under its leadership of a man named John Teasman, who was a free man of color, who was first a teacher at the school and a principal. This is a really interesting moment. There are not many public schools in this period, and even less Black principals in this period. And John Teasman is really active with those mutual aid societies that I've mentioned now a couple times. He works with an organization called the New York African Society for Mutual Relief to organize parades and celebrations of the important anniversaries in this period of gradual emancipation. He ends up getting fired probably for these decisions, but I still think he plays an important role in the lives of these students, and it's an evidence that, as we'll see, students are thinking about their own identity and their African identity in this moment. One other piece I would like to mention here is the 1810 law that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of this talk. In 1810, the New York State Legislature passed a law that made it a requirement that indentured servants be required to be educated in reading and writing by age 21. And in 1822, we suddenly see a massive rise in the number of cases of people saying, I'm not being educated. And the New York Mission Society is really successful in getting these people free. So they're indentured, and just because they haven't learned to write, they're able to achieve full freedom. And I think it indicates the importance of education to Black New Yorkers in this period, that they're aware of a law passed 10 years earlier and know immediately that it's relevant to them the first year it's possible for them to articulate their cases. It's not until we don't have to wait until 1826 and a push from the New York Mission Society. It's Black New Yorkers coming to the society saying, hey, we know that we were free and we should be free and we're held illegally, which all of these different cases I think highlight. So what did work at the African Free School look like? They did a lot of different things. Primarily, they learned to read and to write and to engage in mathematical study. The samples of work, which are small, it's about 30 or so different examples of work, we're not going to look at all of them, just in the record, are filled with these kinds of mathematical studies and practices of handwriting exercises. And it's important to recognize what the fundamental purposes of this school is. It's trying to prepare these students to live in New York, and they're successfully doing that. They're learning about complicated insurance policies and doing math equations and calculating the heights of buildings. But they're also doing other stuff. They're doing drawings. They're preparing these pastoral studies. They're drawing an early American portrait. And what you might notice about these subjects, and I'll say in general, they're all of what I'd say Euro-American subjects. They're either of scenes that look like they're probably from Western Europe or of upstate New York. And so the few examples where we get to see people looking outside of Europe are really exciting, I think. Also, for like a 13-year-old and 16-year-old, I think these are really impressive drawings. Other works highlight just a study of an individual. This one's a little hard to see, but it's of innocence. And we see kind of what I would describe as like a Greco-Roman look to them. They kind of look like busts from a classical education to me. I'm going to conclude with a little bit of a discussion of one poem here by a student named William Seaman, which I find really impressive. So it's an original work of poetry, I should say, and let me begin by reading it. The lion is a noble creature and has a strong, terrific feature. His roaring, which is loud as thunder, strikes all around with fear and wonder. On Africa's dark and sultry shore, this mighty beast is heard to roar, and often dry and barren grounds he most majestically stands. He prowls and roams about at night, and travels tremble with fright. The dare not turn about to fly, thinking that he is very nigh. He roams the desert far and wide, his faithful dam closes by his side. The strongest beast they will attack, and with their paw will breach their back. He's about 13 years old at the authoring of this poem, and it's relatively simple, but I think it's still impressive. And importantly, it's the only piece in this archive that mentions Africa at all, and it's one of only 2 pieces that mention anything other than Europe, the other being a study of a camel. The poem is preceded by a piece called A Short Account of the Lion, which tells you actually just some natural history of a lion, and was probably copied from an exercise book. I want to consider those 2 things together. As indicated, Seaman's writing are unique for 2 reasons. First, that it's the only original composition not written about the school. So the decision to write about a lion and about Africa, I think, is a really conscious one. And as I said already, it's the only work on an African subject. Hopefully, it maybe indicates that this work was being done in other places, because we only have 30 samples, but we don't get to know that. I think we can interpret it as a way of thinking about Seaman's relationship to his African ancestry, and maybe all of those children's relationship to that. While it is impossible to know exactly how Seaman understood his poem, he certainly knew he was writing about an African animal, and that he too was an African. This moment of interpretation is more subtle, I think, than taking the poem as an allegory or as wholly unrelated to Seaman's ethnic background. It should be noted, however, that Seaman was almost certainly born free in New York City and had no memory of Africa, so it's him interpreting something he doesn't know quite about. His opening stanza highlights the lion's nobility and strength, focusing especially on its ability to strike awe and anxiety into others. And his 3rd stanza, I think, continues this role. Africa, for him, is a land where the lion, and perhaps Seaman, is the sole master, as the opening speech that we're not looking at mentions. These 2 descriptions are not, and then in the 2nd stanza, he mentions that it's a dry and barren ground. I don't think those are contradictory, but rather it tells us that the lion is powerful because he has mastered this rigorous climate. As Seaman's short account described, the lion, inflamed by the influence of a burning sun, its rage is most tremendous and its courage undaunted. In other words, the lion has become empowered by its own embittered conditions. In this sense, Seaman's poem speaks to a broader ability to derive power from within struggle. Many of the other pieces of writing took on the form of a moral parable, so I think it seems reasonable to think of Seaman's On the Lion as another kind of moral parable. At one level, he, like the lion, is empowered by his African ancestry. At another, Seaman is empowered by his own personal struggle. Importantly, this second moral does not require us to draw any considerations about Seaman's own understanding of his African identity. Any student in the African free school struggling could take the lion story as their own. That the lion is African only strengthens, not creates, a connection between struggle and working through it. In fact, this idea is seen in another student's emblem, On Necessary Confidence, where we are reminded of the need for hope. Hope is the first great blessing, the prisoner's freedom and the poor man's wealth. In even more direct language, that emblem tells us that the last mad folly is a sad despair. With our understanding of hope and courage, I want to consider the last 2 lines of Seaman's poem. The strongest beasts that they will attack, and with their paw will breach their back. It's probably not referring to the lion's prey, because the prey would not be the strongest beast. Instead, I think it tells that the lion is able to strike its enemy. If the poem is meant to call our attention to courage, then that enemy is fear. If the poem is meant to call attention to hope, then the enemy is despair. If the poem is meant to call attention to perseverance, then the enemy is the lion's conditions, its struggle. The answer, of course, is unknowable, what that strongest enemy, strongest beast is. But I want us to think about those 3 descriptions together. Regardless, the poem is optimistic in its nature. It says that seeing in Africa and beyond the possibility of an enemy vanquished and a step forward in the struggle. I want to conclude by returning to 2 images that we've looked at throughout this talk. And I think that, or hope that I've not presented a portrait of gradual emancipation in which the thorns dominate the vision. They were sharp and painful, but the rose and the eagle remained steadfast. In the moments between precarity, people still managed to find possibilities. Our turn to the school highlights but one moment of that liberty, but others work in mutual aid organizations, and those like Principal Teasman did, and in churches and in neighborhoods, highlight another ability to seek freedom in this moment. I'll leave us with one final emblem written by John Burns and copied from John Huddleston Wine's Choice Emblems. While it's not an original composition, I think the decision to write about it, along with other emblems like liberty, tells us a little bit about what people are thinking about. And it is a reminder to me that hope is well, the first great blessing, and is what people are able to maintain in this period. Even amongst a moment of great precarity, people can still hold on to something. And that despite that, hope is the only thing that those people are able to have and able to continue that freedom. Thank you.
We'll take two questions for Zachary, but then I also want to bring Wena back up and open the floor. Jan.
Zachary, thank you. That was very thoughtful and well delivered, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about in the work that you did you find anything about specifically sort of the rule of law as you approached 1827? Was there legal representation made available on a case-by-case basis, or were folks left to their own devices to argue their cases? That may not.
It's a really good question. It's something that I'm still kind of curious about. The records are really large, and I stopped looking at 1827. People are still working through those cases, and a quick reading of them seems to indicate that the Manumission Society isn't at least seeing it as a problem, so that means they think people are getting freed. I can't say what's actually happening on the ground. The other thing to note is that the Manumission Society is by far their most active in the mid-teens. They're meeting really frequently, really commonly, and at the end of the period, they're meeting maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I think that's not an indication of a failing, but because they continue through 1848, but rather that there's lots of other networks here. So churches, mutual aid societies, those who are actually getting educated are able to work with others and attest for their freedom. Yes.
I was curious about the immigration policy as a way to solve a problem, kind of multi-pronged. Who came up with that idea, and what was promised when they went to Haiti, and how did they arrange with Haiti? Presumably there may not have been a solid government at that time.
Yeah.
How did the whole Haiti thing come into this?
So this is where my future research is headed, I think, to really get at the intricacies of that question. But this part that I'm looking at here is the Secretary of State of Haiti reaching out to the New York Manumission Society stating, we're interested in bringing people, we can provide land for those that are hard workers, essentially. It's also about labor. Haiti, importantly, continues the sugar plantations in this period, and so they're trying to get free labor in because lots of planters are leaving. And there's a civil war going on in Haiti, so the New York Manumission Society is also reaching out to both governments in this period to talk to them and try and figure out what the conditions will be. And that's also part of the New York Manumission Society's worry here, is that people are going to arrive there and just enter into bad conditions, right? And clearly, it's what Haiti ends up offering, I believe, is both land and the ability to work and paying them for the transportation costs. But clearly, some people are not finding it satisfactory. So the broader question of do they actually get it is still a little bit unanswered to me.
Are they going to turn into slaves in Haiti?
Yeah, and I think the legal stuff is really important here, and a lot of other scholars have done a lot of good work emphasizing that actually having the legal right to freedom, even if you have very similar conditions to slavery, is important because you actually get to say, no, what you're doing to me is wrong. And that's certainly an ability that people who are on a plantation in Haiti have to say, actually, these conditions are not acceptable for a citizen. Oh,
This too. Yeah, but you're going to get Wena, come up here. We're going to.
That's my question while she's walking up.
There
Are
you
you
go.
able to tell from the Manumission Society
Or you can stand.
documents whether they viewed the courts as a realistic avenue for relief, or whether they felt the courts were part of the problem rather than part of the solution?
that's a really good question. I think the answer is yes, definitely. But the strategy here is actually twofold. First, they'll reach out to the person. So someone comes and says, I'm illegally held. They'll reach out to the person who owns them and say, you're holding this person illegally, please manumit them. And that actually ends up working pretty frequently, that the person will just do it. And then they're able to go to the courts. And I think in general, when the status can actually be proven in court, they're pretty successful. The reason they end up dismissing cases is when they'll say, we don't have the documents, we don't have something to prove. And the document won't necessarily be a paper of freedom. It might just be that this person was imported, the bill of sale, for example. And so to me, it indicates that they really see the courts as a way to achieve something here, to the point of cruelty and abuse earlier. The response the Manumission Society has is to say, this is happening, can we pass a law in this period to make it so that we can adjudicate for people?
Great
students.
question.
Yeah.
Do you see anything in your research on, like, for example, after the Dutch Indian War, where Native Americans were exported as slaves?
Yeah, there's a little bit in this portion. I can't speak directly to the Dutch Indian War, but in the early 1790s, we see a larger number of cases of people who are being held but have Indian heritage, and any amount of that is enough for the courts to free that person. That's often the portrait I give here of the different cases of trickery are often really intermeshed. So no one was ever freed because their owner was cruel to them, but they were often freed because of some other circumstance. They would find out, oh, this person actually had Indian heritage going back, and so we can free them. Or this person had been imported illegally, and so we can free them.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, did the New York government, provide incentives for like other lawyers outside of the Manumission Society to help, try some of these cases? Because it seems to me, I'm guessing the person who was illegally enslaved or indentured wouldn't have money to pay fees. So was there any sort of incentive for legal?
That's a good question. So I don't know about the New York government, but the Manumission Society, it's PJ Monroe's like the principal lawyer here, and they're not forcing people who are enslaved to pay for those fees, but adjudicating the fees to membership. Okay. So one of the things we see in the later period is that they're like hiring more and more lawyers, and you'll see them adjudicating the fees, but having membership paid for them.
And Maggie, you had a question?
Yeah, the two things that came up, and feel free to take either of
Yeah.
them, depending on what you know more about, which is the first one being, do you have a theory as to why around 1816 the kidnappings really spiked for those couple of years? And the second one being, could you talk a little bit about the process in which you could prove a lack of education? Was that something that the courts were skeptical of? Were there tests? Either one of those.
So let's start with the first one. My running theory is that the War of 1812 is what's happening here, 1812 to 1815. We can see a large number of rise in the year before the war, and then they start dealing with it. Mm-hmm. Part of what's happening in 1816 is the Manumission Society is just more aware of the problem, and so that there easily could have been another spike in 1804. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's a decision to suddenly start exporting when you know that there's a war, there's no longer a war going on. To the second question, I'm not really certain. But I think it's probably on the easier side because of the maybe 15 or 20 cases of people who say they can't read or write. I believe every single one of them is freed. So I would assume it's a pretty liberal approach to that system.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for both of you. Yeah. You both mentioned in your reports the development of community associations to provide a support structure. And I'm wondering whether you had an opportunity to interchange with what those structures look like, both in the Chinese immigrant population and in the free black population, what the similarities are, and whether there are any pronounced differences.
Yeah, this is a really good question because we actually had a conversation during our weekly sessions at JHC of the surprising interconnection or intersection of our research given complete different time periods. Well, I was more focusing on mid 19th century. Zachary was more early 19th century, and two different demographics, but the theme of it is very similar in terms of what were the mutual aid institutions that emerged as a result of the lack of codified policies or a lack of legal support. And I really enjoyed Zachary's last point on hope and courage because I was aiming to end my talk also on this idea of radical imagination. And I think part of that, there's an element of hope and imagination that's interconnected in the sense that you have these folks who throughout history are seen without much agency or who don't have the same sense of resources. They are emerging in a place where they can create these institutions of resources, of legal service, of membership. So it was actually, I think it was at the end of our fellowship that we kind of started to see where they did converge, and it was a very fascinating way of how these very different communities had extreme similarities that I think is very universal to various different groups.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I really enjoyed both your presentations, really learned a lot. I was I guess kind of similar to that last question and on the lines of like community and the archives. Yeah, I especially appreciate how you both incorporated these sort of stories from like the people themselves, and I just found that so fascinating. And I guess my question is just about these archives that very much center around like stories of people themselves who were there at the time, like experienced all of these things going on. I guess during your research, like how did you even like find these archives, and like how were they maybe lacking? How do you think like these archives, I guess, can be improved going forward? Like, because I feel like something that is very real is like there is definitely a lack somehow still, and I think you mentioned that a lot, you know. So yeah, I'm just curious, like, if there's thoughts.
I think in my project, well, I'll say how I came across these. They're by far the largest collection of documents of this very specific issue in the period. And there was a point where I really wanted to look at more specific, those churches and mutual aid organizations, and I'm excited to maybe find some documents for those, but none of those organizations have the kind of extensive record keeping. They have constitutions, documents telling you like what the purpose is, but not here's where we spent money yesterday and the next day, which is to me the really exciting part of history. And I think the thing lost here is maybe two things. One, I haven't figured out a way to maybe communicate it well, but many of these cases are from other people than the person who's actually dealing with it. So it's often like a father or a son or a daughter, and that kind of indicates what the larger spread of this is. But the Many Mission Society is not great at keeping that information, so it's lost often. And then the other thing I'd say is that necessarily this is an archive of problems. It's people coming to the society saying, here's what's wrong, can you help me? And it's very difficult, I think, to record, well, the moments in which just normal life continues.
Very similarly, I split almost my research into what was the correspondence of John Jay, John Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, with then the archival records of these mutual aid institutions themselves, the China Camp, the Huiguans, which there was a stark difference between the two. We had historians come in, talk to us about the Jay Papers, this incredible project where they were able to transcribe a lot of the correspondence and papers of John Jay, who, if you spend a lot of time with him in the archives, he has quite a personality. Compared to what I noticed was more of the quantitative records and more data that was part of the records of these enclaves and these minor camps and the merchants in San Francisco. So there definitely was a stark difference there. But I think what I really enjoyed about this fellowship was that for me, I'm navigating my interest in history and politics. And so this gave me this ability to look at 4 different contingencies, but bring them back to what matters to me in terms of the different organizations that are doing this work in Chinatown and Flushing in New York City. And the idea of this evolving archive, and it's not something that is static or something that I peer into and I look and I correspond with the folks in the archive, but idea of going to Chinatown and looking through the records and newsletters and correspondence of organizations that are still doing the work today. I think that gave me a good balance, and that was something Suzanne actually mentioned for us and pushed for us to do. Instead of solely looking at the archives, there was this emphasis on human connection and human relations and the historical, racial, and politicized complications of that as well.
So I have a question. I'm interested in cause and effect. So can you say a few words about what caused a respectable number of citizens to form themselves into a society for promoting manumission of slaves? What was the thinking before that? What about that?
It's a good question, and not where my best knowledge is, but I think the Manumission Society is happening for a couple different reasons. One, Jay and the others think it's a moral problem. They think that people shouldn't be enslaved, and that is the primary motivation for these individuals. I think second, they're also thinking about how the U.S. is going to move in the next few decades, and that if they're going to work with allies who, France is going to abolish slavery, 9 years later, and Britain abolishing the slave trade or abolishing slavery in 1833. So they're trying to, I think, stay with their kind of global allies and work to keep the nation moving forward and adhering to the principles that they think are so important.
Fantastic.